breathing pattern disorders, particularly breathing mechanics. Today is going to be all about discussing the functional breathing or dysfunctional breathing components of our breathing mechanics. So before we actually dive into those dysfunctions, we probably should start off with what are breathing mechanics and how do they play a role in creating dysfunctional behaviors or perhaps symptomology of stress and anxiety. So first of all, we have to consider breathing mechanics are the very first component of taking a breath. The technical term would be ventilation. The primary role of breathing is to move air in and out of the lungs so that we can get the oxygen from our environment, get it into our body so that we can produce energy. But also we want to remove the carbon dioxide out of our body so that we can remain in a healthy pH range within our blood acidity. Now, what is it that shifts that air in and out? That is a relationship between pressure and volume. That's right. Breathing mechanics is physics. Don't worry, stay with me. We're not going to dive too deep into this. Essentially, what happens is when we breathe is our diaphragm contracts and the external intercostal muscles will also contract and they will pull open the ribcage slightly. This then generates more volume in our thoracic cage, in our thorax in general. Now, you may or may not have heard of Boyle's law. Again, stay with me, a physics law that the relationship between pressure and volume is inverse, meaning if there is a larger volume, the pressure is lower. When there's a pressure that is lower, gas moves from a high pressure to a low pressure, and therefore when we contract the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles on an inspiration, air moves into the lungs. Now this requires energy. It requires force production because we have to overcome elastic recoil forces from our lungs. Remember, our lungs are elastic and stretchy. All they want to do is just recompress again. And in fact, on the exhale, both the diaphragm relaxing and the elastic recoil of the lungs compressing is that one that then generates a higher pressure and therefore the volume of air moves outside of our lungs. That is the general resting breathing pattern, which, believe it or not, is run through just a central pattern generator, which is autonomic, part of our brain called the pre-Boxinger complex, which is just like in the heart, just firing off information. Nothing to do with CO2, nothing to do with anything like that. It's the primary stimulus to breathe is, well, there's no primary stimulus, it's automatic. Breathing mechanics, however, you think, well, air goes in, air goes out. How does this become an issue? And it becomes an issue because it's a behavior. Behaviors are dictated by the motor control patterns of our nervous system, and it's the way in which muscles are recruited to generate a specific mechanical way someone breathes. For example, dysfunctional breathing, one of the most common things seen in dysfunctional breathing is this thing called chest breathing. Sometimes it's termed as vertical breathing. The actual technical term is thoracic dominant breathing, if we're going down the avenue of using scientific language. And essentially what has happened here is someone has learnt a poor behavioral breathing motor pattern. This could be due to lung disease. Most common ones are severe asthma, COPD, emphysema, cystic fibrosis. Those things are all going to lead to expiratory limitation, resistance of breathing out, which then causes an individual to have to breathe from a higher lung volume because there's more air in the lungs. Technical term might be hyperinflation. Now, that shift in where we're breathing from leads to someone to breathe more into their chest, which is actually a more challenging breathing pattern in general because we have the chest wall now that is an additional force that we overcome. We break down the physics of this into detail and the relationship between compliance of the lung and the breathing pattern and actually the lung volumes in the breath science certification. However, for simple sake, we're just going to talk about the structure of the rib cage being at the top more rigid. So therefore, there's a little bit more energy requirement to create a thoracic dominant breath let's say a chest breath. Now, because more work is needed, the body and the nervous system are very good at trying to create adaptations to conserve energy so the breath becomes shallow. So now we have someone breathing into the chest, someone's breathing a shallow breath, which then ends up increasing the frequency of the breathing, which leads to poor ventilation and poor gas exchange, because every single breath we take, we lose a small amount of air to what's called anatomical dead space in the trachea, bronchioles, and bronchi. There's no gas exchange occurring there, so the faster you breathe, the more you lose to dead space, which makes an inefficient gas exchange pattern, which then ruins the next component of breathing, which is respiration, internal and external respiration, related to the biochemical element of breathing, which we'll discuss in a further episode. So how do we spot this? Obviously, there is clearly a physical observation of people, how they breathe. Are they breathing with a movement that is more into their upper chest? And if so, then we can spot that and we can try and help people improve that. Now, how do we start the process of improving that? If it's a behavior, we have to shift the behavior, meaning we have to put some conscious practice in there to go through the behavioral phases of turning a conscious behavior into an unconscious behavior through repetition, i.e. training, breath work, or breathing retraining. Now, I use a simple term when it comes to breath mechanics, and that term is essentially the NGSE principle. And it's because it's the closest word to nose, and that really is the place where we start. Now, I'm not going to dive too much into all the functions of the nose. There is plenty of them, and we dive into those deeply in all the mentorships and training that I offer. However, the nose itself, to overcome this poor breathing mechanics, actually just will pull a deeper breath in general. It's the place where we can start. So N is for nose. G is for gentle. Really, breathing at rest should be very light. You shouldn't be able to hear it, but also you should be able to have conscious control over your breathing so that you can really slow that breath down. So when you're in a challenging situation, you can choose to have greater breath control. The S is for slow. There is a direct relationship between breathing rate and arousal state, meaning that the faster we breathe, the more aroused and stressed and anxious we feel. Therefore, typically for people that are working with breathing dysfunction, we might want to slow that rate down. And E is for expansive. We should have an expansive lateral breathing from our lower rib cage with a relaxed upper chest, and that then becomes a day-to-day practice, maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes, but also checking in with yourself every day to ensure that you're breathing nasal, gentle, slow with lateral expansion. So that is the very basics of breathing mechanics and what we can look to identify dysfunctional breathing mechanics, why it's a stressful breathing pattern, because it increases work of breathing, which sends more signals to the brain of more stress, which also increases psychological threat detection. We'll have another conversation about that in a different time. And the first point of call might be making a conscious practice that's aiming to produce nasal, gentle, slow, expansive breathing. Should you have any questions about breathing mechanics or any questions about breath science at all, pop a comment in there. Leave me a subscription. It really helps the channel. Thank you.